The next period in this region is called the Vedic period. The cities of the Indus Valley civilization began to decline, and we're not exactly sure why. It might have had to do with climate or regional famines, but the Vedic period starts around 1500 and lasts until about 1000 BCE. During this period, nomadic Aryan shepherds move into the region around 1750, and they bring with them bronze tools and instruments, horses and chariots, the Sanskrit written language, and class hierarchies. And probably most important of all, they bring with them new religious practices and religions that demand the appeasement of gods through sacrifice by fire. The foundation of the Vedic period religions are the Vedas, or sacred texts, and Veda means literally knowledge. These are writings that are based on hymns and philosophies that are devoted to the divine king Indra. A very rigid class structure also emerges during this time. And this class structure is part of many of the regional religions, and to some extent is still in practice today. In this structure, you have the priests at the top of the pyramid, then the warriors, then merchants and tradespeople, and at the very bottom you would have the working class, which includes artists. Eventually, new philosophic texts built on the Vedas emerge, called the Brahmanas and the Upanishads. And they are a combination of the Vedic writings with Aryan and local ideas. One of the major ideas is the concept of samsara, which is a constant cycle of reincarnation in which birth and death is repeated and over again. And the goal is to be finally released from this cycle of reincarnation. Three of the four major religions of this region emerged during this time: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Each of these major religions are very important because they drive the making of art that serves the faith and the religious practices of each. The first religion we'll talk about is Buddhism. Buddhism originated in the first millennium BCE, and its foundations are the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who lived between 563 and 483 BCE. He's also known as the historical Buddha because he is the first Buddha. According to the origin story, when Siddhartha Gautama, who was the prince of the Sakya tribe of Nepal, was a small child, and here he is as a baby, a Brahmin, or a wise man, foretold he would become either an enlightened sage or a world conqueror. An enlightened sage would help others overcome their suffering. And at the time, a sage meant being a poor itinerant beggar. So of course, Siddhartha's father would have preferred for him to be a world conqueror. And so he protected the boy by confining him in a palace, giving him every luxury. And here we see him in his palace life, where he is surrounded by riches and luxuries and women. He's also being given the education of a prince. So he is living a very protected and elite lifestyle. When he grew up to be a young man, he told his father that he wanted to see the world and persuaded his father to let him go on a series of journeys. On these journeys, he saw evidence of suffering for the first time, and he encountered figures of an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wandering beggar. Siddhartha Gautama decided to leave his family behind, along with his life of riches and luxury, to follow an ascetic's path. And he wanted to search for truth and ways to overcome human hardship on a quest to find out how to overcome human suffering. Finally, thin and exhausted from his quest, he sat down under a Bodhi tree, or a Bo tree. And you'll notice that this is the root of the word Buddhism. This was a place to meditate at Bodhgana. He meditated until he reached a transcendent state known as enlightenment or nirvana. In this state, he completely understood life and death and became free of human fear and suffering in the endless round of death and rebirth. At this point, he had become a Buddha, an enlightened being who would understand the truth of existence. And from this point forward, he's known as the Buddha. Soon, many Indian sages had gathered around him, and he had a group of followers who listened carefully to his ideas about the problems of suffering and how to overcome it. He preached his first sermon in Deer Park and started preaching and teaching a teaching career which lasted some 40 years until he died at the age of 80. By the time of his death, his followers had memorized his teachings and passed them on to a growing number of disciples who spread the ideas of Buddhism around India. And Buddhism spreads across the subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE. And it was encouraged by Indian emperors Ashoka, who built many shrines and put up Buddhist inscriptions. And you see from this relief carving some of the iconography that we'll start to associate with the Buddha. First of all, deer, a reference to his sermon at Deer Park, and also the wheel, which is a reference to the cycle of birth and death. We also see him in this pose, this lotus pose, which we see over and over again. He also has specific hand gestures, which is kind of an iconography into itself called mudras. Buddhism has no gods per se. According to Buddha, believing in and following the Dhamma, or his teaching, would lead to enlightenment, not worship. So he saw himself as a teacher, but not a deity. Some branches do recognize other figures, such as the saint-like bodhisattvas, and we'll talk about them. They are essentially Buddhas to be, or people, saintly beings who have given up nirvana in a quest to help others achieve nirvana. And they have renounced enlightenment essentially to sacrifice themselves to help others. And some of them are seen almost as saintly. Buddhism teaches the following of the 4 noble truths. The 4 noble truths deal with suffering. First, all life is suffering. And second, the cause of all suffering is desire, that humans want what they cannot have. Third, suffering will end when we are free from desire. And lastly, release from desire and suffering occurs as the result of following the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is essentially a guide for virtuous living. Not a series of 8 consecutive steps to follow, but instead the 8 right elements that Buddhists should attain to practice, should aim to practice all at once. So it's not a stepladder, but rather kind of a code. The first is right understanding, then the right intention, the right speech, the right conduct, the right occupation, and this I think is very telling. Choosing a job that is useful and does not involve such things as bloodshed, arms, slavery, or trafficking, but also sort of understanding that the right occupation is where you are in a class structure. The right effort, the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. There are several key principles that bind all of these elements of the Eightfold Path. First of all, Buddha is asking people to avoid extremes or follow a middle way. On a personal level, he wanted to leave behind luxury and follow the ascetic's way of poverty and finding a balance between them. Second, people should leave behind their ego to reach a state of no self or anatta, to better understand the needs of others and follow certain elements on the Eightfold Path, like the right intention and the right conduct. And third, the other reason to achieve anatta is that Buddhism recognizes samsara and the law of karma. Karma connects all of these ideas to Hindu elements as well. And this is the idea that if there is no self, karma has nothing to attach itself to. So a person becomes closer to achieving samsara and reaching the ultimate goal of a state of enlightenment, known as nirvana in Buddhism. There are several religious practices associated with Buddhism, even though Buddhists do not worship Buddha as a deity. They revere him as a leader, as a teacher. And at the heart of the ritual practice is a recitation of the triple refuge. I go to Buddha for my refuge. I got to Dharma for my refuge. I go to Sangha for my refuge. This is a way for Buddhist followers to voice their commitment to the Buddha as an authoritative teacher and affirm their faith in his teaching. And we do this through a reverence to Buddha and his relics, circumambulation of stupas, and stupas are temples, the first Buddhist temples, through meditation, which is a solitary practice of concentration, a respect for monastic communities, which are places of education and community service, and through festivals. Buddhism, because of its promise of enlightenment and being released from the suffering of this life, became a very popular faith, and it spread pretty quickly throughout Southeast Asia and very rapidly west to China, Japan, and Korea. And it still spreads throughout the world. And here I'm just listing some branches of Buddhism, most of which are still in practice today. The one that we'll be talking about for the most part is Mahayana Buddhism, this one. And Mahayana means the great vehicle. And it really advocates that all people should try and attain enlightenment.